just your take on Ivan Provorov and why he's the only one in the NHL, seemingly, willing to take this stand and stand with God and stand with his biblical teaching.
Well, I'm not sure about the overall demographics of the NHL. So it's definitely a symbol of individual fortitude and moral clarity on his part. But one thing that I was thinking about before the show is it's very difficult for everyday American citizens to understand the culture of Russia and the Russian identity, partly because there's been, infinite propaganda dumped on us. And since before color television, since the start of the Cold War, which started after World War II by all metrics. So it's very hard for people to understand the Russian identity and the Russian culture. The Russians are a very proud people. They don't identify as white. They identify as their own race. And they are Slavs historically, but they identify as Russian. And that's not to say that there's not any corruption in Russia, because Russia is a very, very corrupt country. We all know that, and many Russians will admit that. But there's a distinct game going on here. The Russian culture and the Russian identity is organized through order. They have a common denominator, and that common denominator is their ethno-national identity. It is the Russian people. It is Russia as a nation that always has to remain sovereign and can't be subdued or conquered by foreign nations or foreign powers. That's their common denominator. So they navigate corruption through order with that common denominator. The people who run the West, who have been running the West since after World War II, they want to reorganize the Western identity through chaos. And they want to navigate corruption through chaos. And their way to do so is to take out the bottom of identity. And what happens, my apologies, what happens when you take out the bottom of identity is people become resentful towards the only thing left they have to hold on to, and that's their own physical being, right? And that's why you see a lot of people in this liberal brainwashing become resentful towards themselves, but they're passive aggressive. So they pass on actually being violent towards themselves, and they project all that violence and animosity onto other things. And that's what the LGBTQ movement and much of the social justice cultural movements in the West have become. The Russians aren't playing by that game. They refuse to play by that game. And this young man obviously has a strong sense of his Russian identity.
So you think, and I'm not disputing it, you think his Russian identity, as much as, or if not more so, than his religious identity, is compelling this action, or that they work hand in hand?
They work hand in hand for sure. I mean, first of all, the Eastern Orthodox Catholic Church is the second largest Christian conglomerate in the world. 225 million Eastern Orthodox Catholics. And Russia is a very big piece of that. And all of the former Soviet Union is a big piece of that. Their identity is deeply, deeply rooted to their Orthodox tradition. So I think the two are joined at the hip. But I also believe that he is in this context taking strong cues from the overarching culture coming out of Russia. And you hear Putin and you hear a lot of the Russian, dignitaries and politicians saying the same thing about the West. We're not going to bend to the LGBTQ. And it's really that battleground is really a proxy for them not bending to the New World Order. Right. And that's the other thing people got to understand. And I can't speak to his personal preferences or his sexuality or anything like that. But what I do know is that the people in Russia, all the way at the top, have made a decision that they're not going to concede the ground in a cultural proxy war to LGBTQ because it's a gateway to NWO.
So, man, you've made an interesting point that's taking me here. And I know you're not leaning into the religious aspect of this argument, but it makes me want to ask, do you think the Russian people take their religious convictions more seriously than the American people at this point.
100%. And look, this is not an affirmation. I want to reiterate. Russia is not a country that is void from corruption. It's a very corrupt country. The way they navigate and organize their culture and corruption at bottom has their identity rooted in it. And their identity includes their traditional cultural beliefs and their religious beliefs. But that is a central component of how they identify and how they navigate, the world. America's identity is much, much different. It's much different historically, and it's certainly much different today. Even from a historical sense, we are a corporation. This country is a conglomerate of global corporate interests, right from the word go. I mean, when you look at how the union was actually formed in the different territories and the ownership of the different territories from Europe, we had the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Brits, the French, the list goes on. We were always in a conglomerate of corporate interests. And again, the slave trade, the drug trade, and piracy was at the heart of that. So although our Constitution was informed by Judeo-Christian values, the actual identity of our nation was never contingent upon that. That's a cover story. The Russians are very different, and the Chinese are very different. They believe that their people are the religion, that the religion and their ethnicity are tied. We don't have that. And then as we've had this, this society that is built largely on immigration and pluralism and all of these other, things, now in today's world, we really have an absence of religious identity, but we also have a radical absence of national identity. And those two things are going to hurt us in the future in these battles that we fight against Davos and the globalists, or the battles that we now are in with China and Russia. It hurts us that we don't have an identity. And again, I'll say, when you don't have an identity at bottom, the only thing for you to do is to resent yourself or other people. And we see a lot of that. Makes it hard to form a formidable front against foreign authorities or foreign threats.